Last week I asked you to consider a few questions. So our focus today is going to be a couple of those questions and kind of dig into those questions, but also see what we learn from our answers to those questions and then how we can use those answers to make lasting change in our lives. Now remember, the first question we looked at was, what one attitude, behavior, or experience would you most like to be free of? And I don't know what your answer was. It may have been something really serious like a substance, or maybe it's your relationship with food. Maybe it's how you interact with money. Maybe it's the people in your life and what your relationship with those people is like. But we want to make sure we identify what that issue is and understand that it is impacting our lives. And a key part of really understanding that it's impacting our lives is the second part of that question. We've answered the what question, but it's also very important to answer the why question. Why do you want to be free of it? Again, I don't know your specific answer to the why, but my bet is that it has something to do with that behavior having a negative impact on your life. There's something about that behavior that's leading you to live in a way that you don't want to live. And that's what we find, is that we get these behaviors in our life and we get stuck in a rut. And we have this behavior that we just can't seem to get free of. So this week, as we continue our series, Renew Your Mind, here in part 2, we're going to look at this idea of being stuck in a rut. And not just looking at the idea of being stuck in a rut, but what can we do with that? How do we get unstuck from the rut? How do we get ourselves out of that rut and really start looking at how we can live our lives more fully? Now remember that in this series, we're looking at renewing our minds. And last week when we started the series, we went back to this letter from the Apostle Paul, and he gave us some indication, some insight on how we can renew our minds. What Paul said was, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Remember, what we looked at there is that when Paul tells us that we can be transformed by the renewal of our minds, he specifically was telling us that it's a multi-step process, that you've got to go through a series of stages in order to achieve lasting transformation. To really free ourselves, we need to be willing to go through a series of steps. Remember that last week, the first thing we talked about was that we have to start out by making a decision to actually start, to make a commitment to start, and to make a commitment to stick with it. That we need to do that work to really commit ourselves, because this will be challenging at times. And so you want to be committed to stay with it. And then once we make the decision to start, we then have to identify that behavior that we want to be free of, which hopefully you did this week as you addressed those questions. But then also it's so important to identify the why. If we don't understand the why, we don't understand why we want to be free, then we're not going to be able to have that motivation and that commitment to do the work. Because making lasting, deep change will have times that is very hard. And if you're not motivated, if you don't really know what you're trying to get to, why you're trying to get to something different, or why the behavior is hurting you, it's going to be very hard to find the motivation to stay with it. So if you haven't already addressed those questions, please take the time this week to do so. Identify what you want to be free of and understand why you want to be free. So now this week, we want to look at the next step. We'll look at what we need to do to actually start doing the work to get free. Start doing the work to get free of that behavior that we want to be free of. And remember that we know what doesn't work. We know that behavior modification doesn't work. We can't simply say that, well, I don't like this behavior, so I'm just going to stop. Or I don't like this behavior, so I'll just do something else instead. Do you know how we know that doesn't work? Because if it did, you would have already done it. That if we could simply change our behavior, just modify our behaviors, getting rid of habits that are harming us would be easy. So what do we have to do to actually make this kind of lasting change, to have kind of real renewal? Well, we need to start by understanding the source of the issue. We need to know, why did the behavior start? And the thing I want to really caution us about, if we start kind of looking at why did the behavior start, that can often lead to a lot of negative self-talk. So often we can be like, why did I ever start doing this? Why did I do it in the first place? And we start saying terrible things to ourselves. I'm just an idiot. I do stupid things all the time. Or, I'm just lazy. I'm just not willing to do the work. Don't do that to yourself. That doesn't help. Right? Give yourself a break. If we spend a lot of time beating ourselves up for past decisions, that's just going to ensure we stay stuck. The thing that's most important for us to do is simply recognize where we are and be willing to make the commitment to do the work to be different going forward. What has happened has happened. You can't change that. So just give yourself a break, but commit to do the work to change things going forward. So now to help us understand kind of how we got here and what goes on, I want to actually look at a couple of verses from a very old book. It's actually from what we call the Old Testament. It's what's called the book of Isaiah. Now, this is an ancient book. It was written about 2,700 years ago. And the book of Isaiah talks about a whole bunch of different things. And we're going to look at just a really small piece of it. And some of the things that the book of Isaiah talks about is how the people of ancient Israel got off track. Kind of where did things go wrong for them? So as we look at that, we can kind of get some insights, I think, into where things get off track for us. Now, this couple of verses we're going to look at actually relate to the story of a woodworker, a person who works with trees and kind of works with that. And as you look at this, the woodworker starts out doing something very natural. Right? He collects the tools that he wants to work with. He goes out, he cuts down a tree, he prepares the wood, he gathers all the wood, and initially he uses it in a really reasonable way. What Isaiah tells us. The woodworker burns part of the tree to roast his meat and to keep himself warm. He says, that fire feels good. So the wood here is being used for a really good thing, right? It meets a need. It provides comfort. Right? Basically, the wood is a tool that's being used the way it's intended, and that's a good thing. But then what happens is that this wood that was a really useful tool starts to develop kind of a bigger part of the woodworker's life. The woodworker at some point starts feeling like something's missing, that he feels like there's some kind of, we'll say, an emotional hole that he's trying to fill. And so the woodworker is looking for something more. So what does he do? Well, he looks back at the wood that he had collected that had provided real comfort in his life. And then what he does is that useful tool that provided comfort, he starts looking for it to do something more. And before long, he's using it in an unhealthy way. Because Isaiah continues. Then he takes the wood that's left, and he makes this god, a carved idol. He falls down in front of it, worshiping and praying to it. Rescue me, he says. You are my God. So what happened? Now, I want to just caution you, don't get hung up on words like idol or, he's bowing down to a god. I'm not saying that's what anyone is doing. And I'm sure your reaction to something like, well, I don't do that. And I know when I first looked at things like this, that was kind of my first reaction too. And I'm not saying that any of us are doing that we're actually kneeling down before some idol. But if we're willing to step back a little bit and look at the whole picture of what's going on with this woodworker, I think we can kind of see how it might apply to some of the struggles that we have. Initially, this woodworker had a real need. He needed to cook his food. It was cold. He needed to stay warm. In those scenarios, using the wood was a good thing. It was a really useful tool that provided comfort and met the need it was intended to meet. But then for some reason, things went too far. The woodworker started using the wood in a way that was not good. He went from using the tool to meet a real need to instead using it as a crutch, trying to fill some gap. And what ends up happening is that things get upside down at that point. The thing that was meant to serve the woodworker instead ends up being served by the woodworker. So the question is, how does that apply in your life, right? How does that apply in my life? Well, we see that the things we're looking at that are good can end up drawing a lot of our attention, and we end up serving them. I mean, things that can start out for a really good reason can start to get away from us, right? Something that initially helps us can start to control us. And there are lots of different examples of this sort of thing. Again, think of the idea of money, right? That money is a really useful tool. But if I focus on money too much and money becomes more important than the people in my life, well, then I start to serve the money and I start to focus just on money. Or it can go the other way with money, that money, again, being a useful tool, but if I start relying on money to try to make me feel better about everything, what happens? Well, I get stuck in debt. I start buying homes I can't afford, cars I can't afford, clothes I can't afford. And before long, that thing that was meant to serve me, money that helps me live better, I end up serving it because I'm stuck in debt and I'm trying to kind of pay my way out of debt. Or maybe another example might be that maybe there was a period in your life where there was some really serious stuff going on and it was creating a lot of anxiety for you. And you were having a tough time dealing with that anxiety. So you went and talked to your doctor and the doctor gave you some meds that helped the anxiety. And during that period, those meds were really helpful and they were a really useful tool to get through a really difficult time. But then as time went on, all aspects of life started to get really hard to deal with, and we start to crave the meds and we start to rely on those meds to deal with everything. Or maybe you're someone who grew up in a home filled with uncertainty. Maybe there was financial uncertainty, maybe your parents weren't around, maybe your parents were just really difficult, maybe they were abusive. And that created a lot of uncertainty in your life. So now as an adult, you try to get rid of that uncertainty by trying to control everything, trying to control every aspect of your own life, every aspect of your kids' life, even as they grow up, trying to control all of their life. And before long, we're trying to control everyone around us, and we're trying to control everything. And that really gets really heavy really fast. And now we're stuck in the cycle of trying to control everything when we know we can't actually control everything. These are all cases where things that started out as reasonable and good start to get away from us. And whatever your specific scenario is, eventually we end up with these things starting to dominate our thinking. And that's when we find ourselves stuck in a rut. We find ourselves in a cycle of behavior that we can't break free of. Now again, I want to remind you that do not beat yourself up. This sort of thing happens to kind of all of us at some point, at some level. In fact, I was reading a stat just recently that 40% of Americans are either currently tied up in an addictive behavior or battling with some type of mental health issue. And that's just the people who actually have an issue that's actually considered a diagnosis. If we were to extend that to everyone who's got habits and things going on in their life that they don't really want there, it's going to be way more than 40%. I think probably getting pretty close to 100% at that point, because we're all dealing with something. So don't beat yourself up. Just recognize that you've got this behavior that you want to get free of and be willing to do the work for it. And understand that there is a source to what led to this. There is actually something that can be identified that can help you understand where you've gotten to. And so often it starts with some kind of unmet need, either a physical need or an emotional need. And because of that unmet need, we started to try to find comfort. And at some point, what we were seeking to provide as comfort got out of control. At some point, that thing that was meant to serve you has somehow taken over. Now somehow it appears to be in control. So how do we get free? How do we get free from that? Well, it turns out we can actually find a pretty good picture of the answer in a short poem. Now this poem was actually written about roughly 30 years ago. It was written by a woman who was actually an actor, a singer, and a poet. Her name was Portia Nelson. And the poem is called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. So let's take a look at this poem. It starts, Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes me forever to find my way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in it again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit. But my eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk, but this time I walk around it. Now at this point, it seems like the poem is done, right? It seems like we have the answer. We can go down that same street, but we know to walk around the hole. But the wisdom of the poem comes from its final chapter. It reads, Chapter 5, I walk down another street. That poem captures the source of our challenges and the solution. We're in a situation where we find ourselves stuck. We're stuck in a pattern of behavior because of something that has happened to us. Maybe that original behavior was your doing. Maybe it wasn't. In fact, I say it probably wasn't in most cases. That original behavior came from a real need that was there. But then we find ourselves repeating the behavior even though we don't like the outcome. We find ourselves stuck. And we remain stuck in this pattern of behavior until we understand how we got there. And we remain stuck in this pattern of behavior until we admit our role in repeating the behavior. But learning to just avoid the behavior isn't enough. We have to get out of the rut that keeps leading us into that behavior. We have to renew our minds. We have to learn to think differently. We have to learn to walk down a different street. That's the work that we have to do. So, to help us learn how to walk down a different street, we first have to understand how we got on the wrong street in the first place. And we have to understand how we're keeping ourselves on that wrong street. So to help us with that, I have a few questions I'd like you to consider in the week ahead. Now, as I always suggest, don't just think about these questions. Take a moment and actually write down your responses to these questions. So the first question, what reasoning do you use to justify that behavior that you wish you were free of? Because if you don't really want it, or if you see it as bad, that means you're justifying it somehow. Each time you start, you're justifying it somehow. And another way to look at that question, it's kind of a harsh way to say it, but I think it really captures what we have to think about. What lie do you sometimes tell yourself to make that behavior okay? We have to be honest with ourselves. And if we're lying to ourselves to deal with the behavior, we need to recognize that we're lying to ourselves. So now our next question. Being painfully honest with yourself, what feeling or emotion are you trying to create, or are you trying to escape when you undertake the behavior? These sort of things that we just can't seem to get free of, even though we want to, are tied to our feelings and emotions. So we're seeking something, or we're trying to escape something. So it's so important to remember what that feeling or emotion is. And then the third and final question, why do you feel the need to create or escape that feeling or emotion? And again, this why question is so important, because if you really dig into the why do you feel like you need to do this? Why do you feel like you need to add this feeling into your life? Or why do you need to get away from that feeling? It'll start to help you understand where it comes from and what's driving you into it. And what was that original source? And it often can help us see that thing had started out providing comfort, how it progressed, into something that seems to control us. My friends, please be willing to do this work, because if you will do this work, if you will spend the time to understand these aspects of what's going on, you will start to move to freedom. The solution to getting free is understanding these kinds of questions. And then as you get free, and as all of us within our church come together, each doing the work to get individually free, we come together, we support one another. And as we start to get healthier, we can begin to answer the call that God has on our life to serve the people around us, to serve one another, to care for one another. And if we can come together as a healthy church that's supporting and caring for each other, and supporting and caring for the people around us, and supporting and caring for this region where God has placed us, we can really bring hope and healing to the people around us. My friends, please be willing to invest in and do this work. Please join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, I am abundantly grateful for all that you give us, Lord. I am abundantly grateful again for our church family. Lord, I'm abundantly grateful for this wisdom that leads us to see that the challenges we have in our life so often started out with things that were providing comfort and that were helping us, but this somehow just got out of bounds, Lord, and we kind of lost control over it. Lord, I pray for your peace and comfort for each person watching, that as they go through this process, as they do this work, Lord, I pray that they would embrace the freedom that you give, the hope that you give. Lord, that no one would be beating themselves up. No one would just be kind of just beating themselves up for past choices. Lord, I pray that we would all have that strength to say, you know what, my past is my past. I can't change that. And then we would embrace our present, and you would give us each the strength to do the work going forward, to make the changes, to have the healing, to be part of the healing of our own lives, embrace that healing, and then to step into what you've called us each to do, care for the people and world around us, Lord. Pray we would all step boldly into that call, Lord, and I pray that we'd all know your strength and healing in this process. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.